Hey guys, Jim here and welcome to Budget RC. I'm 2 weeks late with this video, but I think it was worth it. This week, we're upgrading to a whole new front end, including stand-up shocks, bell crank steering, and a front-mounted battery. So stick around. Hey guys, welcome back. So like I said in the intro, this is a big week. It took me 3 weeks to do this, so I'm 2 weeks late, but I'm real happy with the results. This pile beneath me is some of my prototypes. And every one of these prints took about 4 hours. And that's why this took so long. Every little change I had to make, I had to do another print to test fit, test things out. And every time I would change something, the one thing I was trying to fix would cause something else not to fit. So it was a long time coming. But what we have now is a front-mounted battery tray with stand-up shocks and bell crank steering. So we've got a few benefits coming from this. One, we've got the stand-up shocks, so everything works a lot smoother. These shocks actuate nice and smoothly, and it gives us the option to play with some of the rates as well as the shock positioning. If you see here, I used SCX10 shock towers. These are the rear shock towers. I did have to cut the body post mounts off of the top because they interfered with the cage on the body. But other than that, they're completely stock. And this gives you the option to go with some nice aftermarket aluminum ones if you want as well. Additionally, we've got a bell crank system that now gives us more steering than we had previously. So this is going to help it steer better. And we've got the battery up front, so it's going to help with weight distribution when we're trying to climb up some hills. And even side hilling and in other situations, because the battery is mounted lower than it used to be back here, I think it's just going to handle better all around. That just doesn't get old. So this is a 3D printed design. This is one of my older ones, but I can use it just to go over some of what it's got. We've got these mounting holes here, which are the same as the mounting holes on the original plate. So we're using all of the original mounting points. I also have this hole here because if you want to keep the stock steering, you can use the stock steering. I've got these holes back here, which right now have a couple of screws in them to mount the new bell cranks. We've got supports underneath. We've got the pieces up front that mount right to the front of the body so that we still have our hinged body and it keeps it more rigid. We've got on the sides, we've got some adjustable mounts for those SCX10 shock towers. And right here, we've got some mounts for an additional piece to screw in that helps hold the battery in place. I've also got these holes here so that you can transfer the battery strap to it. If you look here, we've got some of the bell cranks that mount underneath, along with the reuse of some of the other hardware, so that we didn't have to actually buy anything for this except for a few screws. So we didn't spend much this week, but we sure gained a lot, provided that you have a 3D printer. For those of you who don't have a 3D printer, you can make this out of Kydex, but you're probably going to have to spend some time. If you start with a sheet of Kydex, bend it up on the sides, you can drill your holes for the SCX10 shock towers, and then instead of just using the 3D printed part, you'll have to use some spacers, probably around 5 millimeters, to allow this to sit and have clearance over the areas where it mounts. Other than that, you'll need to locate the holes for your bell cranks and use some more spacers underneath for that. The one caveat is that you're not going to be able to tie into the front area where it hinges, so it just may not be as strong. But you can do it with Kydex. I would encourage you guys that don't have a 3D printer to give that a try. So overall, that's pretty much what we have for this week. If you look at the Thingiverse file below, in addition to the base plate itself, we've got the battery mount. We've got this piece that ties the two shock towers together for additional strength. I've got those bell cranks, and I've also got a few 5 millimeter spacers for the shocks if you don't use the aluminum ones like I'm showing here. So now for those of you who are interested, I'm going to take you through a step-by-step installation procedure. I tend not to show every single step because I think it's boring. I don't want to listen to myself talk that long, and I don't think you do either. But on this one, you're going to have it on and off a dozen times if you don't follow a very specific sequence. So I think it's worth taking you guys through step by step so that you'll get an idea. So now we'll get on with the installation. So the first thing that we need to do is take apart all the stuff. Now I've already done some of that because I needed to rob some parts. But the only thing I've really done so far is to disconnect these arms here from the cantilevers. And I'll explain why in a little while. So the first thing we're going to want to do is just spin these front wheels off, and then we're going to take this clamshell off as well, just to get that stuff out of our way. Okay, so I've got the clamshell off, I've got the front wheels off. Neither one of those is completely necessary. You can do it with those on, but it makes it a lot easier as you're moving things around, and it gives you guys a better view of what's going on if I have that stuff out of the way. So as I mentioned, the first things you're going to want to do is disconnect these links here. I've already disconnected them from the cantilevers. So now we're just going to zip them off of the bottom, and we'll move them aside. We will be reusing one of these later on, which is why I've already got them disconnected, because there are some changes I've made to it that I'll go through with you guys. For now, I'm just going to put these screws right back in the original holes, since we're going to need to reuse them anyway. And we'll be reusing a lot of the screws on this. Other screws need to be replaced with longer hardware. And I'll try to give you guys a description of what hardware I'm using in what places. So the next thing we can do is to go ahead and get the top part of these shocks off. So now we're just going to use a nut driver. You can use the T-shaped one that you have a million of lying around. Pop this nut off. Now when you take these out, put them aside. You're going to need to get the bearings out of these, because you're going to need to reuse those later. Now once this is off, you need to take these studs out. Now this is where, if you've got a nut driver like this, you can kind of beat. So you got to go back to the old faithful, assuming that you've got one that you can see through, so it'll slide right over. If not, just grab yourself a small wrench and get this right off. If you don't have a wrench, you can use a pair of pliers. It might booger it up a little bit, but we're not reusing these. Speaking of not reusing things, one thing I was very careful of when designing this was to make sure that I didn't make any modifications to the vehicle itself. And as you can see, I've put it back to stock for this video, even though I've already had all the upgrades installed. Once you get those off, now you can take this support plate off. All right, so once we've got those off, we've got one more in the middle here that holds the stock steering. So now that can come off. So the next thing we want to do is disconnect this steering arm. And these are just ball cups, so they'll pop right off with a little bit of a twist. And you can take this off both sides, put it aside. We will be reusing it. What you want to do now is flip it over, and you want to get to these screws here to get these arms off the steering linkage. Get one side off, push your steering, it'll give you clearance to get to the other side. Okay, so once those are off, the next step is to take this factory steering contraption out. I did design this to work with the factory steering. So if for any reason you want to retain this instead of going to the bell crank design, you can do it. That's what this screw hole here is for. The screw hole here is what screws right into the top of here, and everything fits under here just like it would with the stock setup. Now, I wanted to get rid of this for two reasons. For one thing, the sliding thing here works okay when it's new and clean. Once you get some dirt and grime in there, this can get really sticky. And especially with this weak factory servo, that's kind of a bad recipe. Secondly, this has limited throw, and this is what limits the maximum steering angle you can achieve with this. So by going to a bell crank, I can make my steering go all the way until these knuckles hit, and it gives me a little bit more steering. So now what we're going to do is to take this piece out, and to do that you need to take this whole front assembly off, which is only 4 screws, and it's really easy to do. So we're going to pop these 2 screws out and these 2. Okay, so once all your screws are out, this piece comes right off. So now we've got 2 more screws on either side of the diff that hold this steering arm in. So go ahead and pop those off, and then the steering arm will come right off. Okay, so once you get those screws off, this piece comes right off. Now put it aside, but you're going to need to save it because you're going to want to grab this ball stud in a little while. Okay, while this is off, we want to take this servo arm off. Now what I like to do is just kind of get this as vertical as possible, just so we have a pretty good starting point and we know the new one gets put on in the same place. So remove that center screw. Slide this off. Now you're going to want to take this ball stud out of it. Now you want to take your new arm. Mine's purple because it happened to come with one of my other servos, but you can get the same style arm pretty much anywhere for a couple of bucks. We're going to want to put this in the lower hole. Because this is metal on metal, you're going to want to use Loctite, which I'm not doing. Get it good and snug. Put this in as vertical as you can get it. Drive your screw back in. Again, Loctite is recommended. This style also has a screw on the side, so we'll snug that up. So the next step is going to be to put this back onto the vehicle. One thing you want to make sure of is just that you get your dog bone reinstalled so that your front drive works. So hold it up vertical, slide it in, get it where it goes. Now you can throw your screws in. All right, so once you get them all started, go ahead and snug them up. It's a good idea to put some Loctite on them, which I'm not doing because I don't have it down here in my dungeon at the moment. Once we have that, now what we want to do is put the vehicle aside for now. Now these are my shocks that I chose, and these are just a cheap pair of shocks that I got on eBay. I'll have the exact price below because I bought them so long ago now I can't remember. But I think they're about $8 or $9. And they're nothing special, but they work. They're in the price point I needed to keep this within my $250 budget. You can obviously spend more on better shocks and you'll certainly benefit from it. But these work pretty well. They're pretty smooth. The springs might be a hair on the stiff side, so I'm going to probably experiment with springs at some point. But overall, they're not too bad. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that the balls that come in these are too wide to fit in here. So what you're going to need to do are take those arms that came out of there, pop the balls out, and swap them into the bottom of the shocks. Now, I've already done that here, which is why those weren't installed, because those were too big to fit where they needed to go. These are the small ones, and that'll allow it to fit right in here. Now, these are kind of a snug fit. I don't know if you can tell on camera, but they work a little stiffly. They're not loose and floppy like the top ones are. They'll loosen up over time, and there's not enough range of motion with the shocks being vertical like this for it to have much of an effect at all. But it is something to keep in mind. We're also going to take one of these arms and we're going to use it on our steering bell cranks. And I want the low profile ball on there. Right now I have the thicker one on here that came off of the shocks. Since you're going to have to transfer these, I thought it'd be a good idea to show you how to pop these out. Now, if you've got a flat desk, you can put it right on the edge of the desk. Pretend this is a desk. And you can just push down. Sometimes that'll work. Another idea is to just take your driver here, slide it right over, give it a push, you'll feel it come off. Then it'll come right apart. Now to pop this back in, take your nut driver again, take your hex again, bang, it's all installed. So these are the 4 bearings that you're going to pop out of those suspension rocker arms, and we're going to reuse them in our bell cranks. These are the bell cranks that we're going to use, and again, these were something I designed and printed. And you can see the holes here where we're going to pop those in. Now, to do that, you want to make sure that they're well aligned. So what I have done is to use this again to help keep things aligned. Put that in there. Put that over. Now you can use your fingers, pop it right in. Flip it over. Do the same thing on the other side. Pop it right in. Now we can do the same thing with the shorter bell crank. So on the original steering, you've got this ball stud. So we're going to want to take this off and we're going to transfer it to our new bell crank. So go ahead and thread it into the short end of the bell crank. And just make sure it's snug. It doesn't need to be too tight. And then we can get the bell cranks installed. So now we're going to start pre-assembling some of our steering. What we want to do is take 2 M3 by 25 millimeter pan head screws. Take one of those suspension arms. Slide these down through. Now what we want to do is install the bell crank onto that screw through the hole on the long side. Put our bearing back. And now we can put this on the passenger side, just like this, on the passenger side of our assembly. Once that's on, we can run a nut down it to keep it in place. M3 nut. You're going to have a couple M3 nuts left over from the cantilever mounts, but you're going to need at least 2 more anyway, so I just grabbed some of my black ones so that everything matches. Now to tighten this up, you're going to need your hex on one end nut driver on the other side. And what you're going to want to do is tighten this till it's snug. And then you're going to want to back off a little bit. Because once this is snug, this arm doesn't move freely. So just back off ever so slightly until it works nice and freely. So now we'll do the same thing with this side. Slide this over. Countersunk screw. Slide it onto here. And tighten the nut. So same deal here. Tighten it till it's snug. Then just back off just a hair till things are nice and loose. If you back off too much, you'll wind up with a bunch of play in it. And you don't want that. So now what we want to do is start installing this into here. This requires another little bit of a balancing act, but the first thing we want to do is try to get these at least fairly well positioned, get them over those screws. They'll probably fall off, but at least things will be close. Now to install this, we're going to use 4 M3 16mm countersunk screws, and they're going to mount in the same spots as the original pieces did. And until you get all 4 started, just run them in real loose. This back one here is a little bit tough because the servo can be in the way. But once you get it down a little way, it'll kind of position itself as needed. Once those are positioned, you can get these front 2 in. Alright, so once you've got all 4 of those started, go ahead and snug them. So the next step is to go ahead and reattach our steering. Go ahead and turn it upside down, make sure this arm is attached, and then you can start another M3 nut on it. At this point, I'm just looking for a couple threads to engage. That way we can move this to expose the screw on the other side so that we can do the same. Once you get your nut engaged, you can go ahead and snug this right down. Because of the ball studs, you don't need to leave this loose. And then we can go to the other side. Move this back, do the same thing on the other side. So originally the steering arm was opposed 180 degrees. We need them to be opposed 90 degrees. So when I hold this here, I've got one ball cup facing back for the servo, and the other ball cup is facing straight down to attach to the one that's connected to our bell crank. So now we can feed this in from the servo side, snap it in. Now what we can do is move the steering so that we've got room to snap this side in. There. Now once it's all snapped in, you can recenter things. There shouldn't be much play, everything should be fairly snug. But you're good to go with your steering. So the next thing we're going to do are install the shock towers. The way I designed this was to be able to use standard SCX10 rear shock hoops. You do have to cut the body post mount off of the top because it interferes with the cage on the 10428B. I don't know if it'll interfere with the 10428A or not. Certainly it wouldn't interfere with the twin hammer style. But in any case, you do want to take these off if you've got the same body style that I do. And you can see here that we've got 3 sets of holes so that you can change the position. You've also got 3 holes on the top so that you can really have quite a few options with how you mount your shocks and whether you lay them down or stand them up. I'm going to stick with everything in the middle until I have a chance to drive it. So to install it for now, I'm using these 6mm button head screws. What you really want to use instead of a button head is a countersunk screw so that it fits better into here. And if you use a countersunk, you're going to want to go down to a 4mm so that they don't stick out the other side into the battery area. I'll be changing these later, but for now I'm just running these. So once that's installed, now we can install the shocks. And like I'd said before, I've already swapped in these smaller ball cups from the other arm into the bottom of here so that they'll fit down between these posts. If you haven't done that yet, go ahead and do it. And you do only need to do that on the bottom. Once you do that, you can just tighten this up, turn that, and now we can install into here. And now for that installation, you're going to want a 25mm long button head M3 screw. You're also going to need a spacer. In the print file that's hosted on Thingiverse, I have some spacers that you can print, or you can go to your local hardware store and buy these little aluminum ones. The only problem with the aluminum ones is that the hole's a little too small, so you do need to enlarge it. I just enlarged these with a 1/8 inch drill bit. So now we can slide this in here, Slide that in there, and we can fit this right up into here. Just get it started for now. You don't want to go too far. You want to go until the screw is about flush with the inside of the shock tower. So far in my prototypes, this is about how I've had things set up. But I did design and print the spacer that goes right into here just to add some more strength to the overall shock tower. So now we can continue a little bit further along, and you just need to go until things are snug. So now we can do the same thing on this side. So next thing we can do is position our battery. For now I'm using the stock battery, but I've also got a shorty pack on the way. If you can see these holes here, what these are for is to mount this piece that's also part of the printed kit. And this is to hold the front of the battery. So we're going to want to slide the battery in, whatever battery you use. And in this case, it looks like I can use the second set of holes. And like I said, when I get a different battery pack, that'll change. But that's the beauty of this, is that I can just move it as needed. And this is just a set of M3 button head screws. I think they're about a 16 or 20 millimeter length. So now we should be able to slide that pack right into here, tighten up the Velcro, and we've got ourselves a nice securely mounted pack. Now one thing I want to do is go ahead and plug this in, and I'll show you how the steering works. Now if we turn the steering, you can see that this will take it, once the servo gets there, pretty much as far as this can go. I have already set the end point so that it won't go too far. But now we've got good steering, and more steering than what we used to have. So now the last thing to do before we wrap this up and put our wheels back on is just to reinstall the body, and we can put some new screws through here so that we still have our hinge point. So you want to make sure that your magnets are reset. What I'm using here are a couple of M2.5 by 25 millimeter screws, and these are about 5 or 6 millimeters longer than the originals. Get it through the new part, through the body, and then finally into that last. Get it started, do the same thing on the other side, and then you can send them home. So now we've got that all back together. Make sure you leave these a little bit loose, that way everything pivots real well. And now we should be good to put the wheels on, and then we're all done. So this week the only actual expense that I had was about 10 bucks for these shocks on eBay. I'll give you the link below. And a handful of screws. Now the screws I'm not adding to the cost because I have piles of these things around. Anyone that works on RCs should too. This is my pack of 2.5 millimeter screws. I've got a ton of 3s, 4s, anything you're gonna need on these cars you should have. That said, as I went through the installation procedure, I showed exactly what screws I used and where so that you can get an idea of what you need. So anyway guys, that's it for this week. Hope you guys liked it. I know it took me forever, but I really liked it. And I hope that you guys actually give this one a try if you've got a printer. If you do, let me know in the comments below how it worked out. Till then, we'll see you next week, guys. Thanks.